have notice of a request for an emergency debate from the Honourable Member for Winnipeg North, and I will hear him now.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would ask, in giving consideration, two things in particular be taken into your thinking. One is the fact, Mr. Speaker, it was just last week we heard from the report on the Truth and Reconciliation report, and two, in regards to the fact that we are now in the dying days of a session, and what I'm referring to is an event that actually took place 4 years ago, Mr. Speaker, and it would be an absolute shame if we were not able to provide some of the answers that need to be provided to our First Nations or to the First Nations community that have been impacted in such a very real and tangible way. I would like to thank Dr. Merle Ballard in particular, along with Cindy Woodhouse, for their input and making sure that I had a better understanding of the seriousness of the issue. And what I'd like to be able to do is to share that with you, Mr. Speaker, and members of the opposition and government in hopes that they'll understand why it is that it's very important that we move ahead with this particular emergency debate. As it has been provided to me, Mr. Speaker, and I share with the House, in 2011, the province of Manitoba flooded out over 5,000 First Nations living downstream from the Fairford Dam from what they called a natural flood. This was, in fact, not a natural flood. The First Nations were deliberately flooded out. Lake St. Martin First Nation is still 100% displaced. Little Saskatchewan First Nation still has half of its 800 members still displaced. Induced displacement has left the First Nations very vulnerable, Mr. Speaker. Without a land base, this leads to cultural genocide, many would argue. The First Nations people are scattered throughout Manitoba. The social fabric of their communities has been destroyed. Their homes have been destroyed. Many are homeless and are ending up on the streets of Winnipeg and elsewhere. Their economic and traditional livelihoods have been destroyed. They are suffering and dying due to a physical, emotional, and mental stress and trauma of being displaced. Lake Martin First Nation has had over 10% deaths since the evacuation. Children are being exposed to racism and are joining gangs and other activities they were not exposed to when they were living in their own communities. Women are miscarrying, people are committing suicide, people are dying tragically and prematurely. They emphasize, Mr. Speaker, in a very bold way and asking us to remind you and members of the House that removing children to attend residential schools was a cultural genocide. The removal and relocation of entire communities in a day and age is also, they're suggesting, cultural genocide, Mr. Speaker. What is the government going to do to relocate these communities back to high and dry land, Mr. Speaker? In short, there is 4 points that are really being emphasized, Mr. Speaker. 1, induced displacement and loss of land leads to cultural genocide. 2, induced displacement is impacting on the health of the evacuees. 3, the First Nations need new land and dry land which they select for themselves to meet their community needs, and induced displacement has led to a loss of traditional and economic livelihoods. Yesterday, Mr. Speaker, I posed the question to the Minister, and the Minister's response clearly demonstrated the need for the House to be able to debate the issue today. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank the Honourable Member for raising the question, and while there's no doubt that he feels very strongly about this particular issue, I don't find that it meets the test for an emergency debate.